fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. And today, like the weeks before and hopefully many weeks to come, we will try to have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking, with the idea, with the concept, with the hope and desire to advance the frontier of that thinking. Today I am talking to Dr. Rajesh P.N. Rao. He is the C.G. and Elizabeth Huang Professor of Computer Science and Engineering and the co-director of the NSF Center for Neurotechnology here at the University of Washington. He has won a lot of awards. He works in a wide range of topics, but he is most famous for a series of experiments and labs that he has set up investigating brain-computer interfacing. Yes, he claims to be able to change things, to do things in the world simply by thinking about them. This piqued my interest, so I thought we should talk to Professor Rao and see what his thinking might have to teach us about architecture. Here we go. Welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I mean, in some ways, you are at the... I mean, the interesting thing about you is, on the one hand, you're a nerd.
I accept that quite graciously. Okay.
You're a weird computer engineering type.
Right.
And in that sense, you are at the, you're an artificial intelligence man.
Right.
And you're...
And natural. Yes.
and natural. And
Right.
you're doing natural intelligence.
Yes.
You're doing the brain.
Combining
and
them.
combining the brain with robotics.
Yes.
And you're going to talking about humanoid computers and teaching computers as if they were our kids and how kids learn. Some computers can learn, and then soon we'll be teaching our kids the way computers learn. It's
They already are. The kind of electronics, gadgets they're used to now.
I know. And the iPad and the iPhone is probably teaching them
to essentially swipe at every surface that they see, right?
and to think that way.
Yes, the world works by swiping.
World works by swiping, and you have to be able to do this to the world.
Yes, I mean that's actually where we kind of come into this conversation about interfaces and tools. So a lot of what we do, especially this brain-computer interface, you can sort of look at that as the culmination of tools that we've created for ourselves. In the sense that, at the very early stages, we had, rock tools, right? We had stones that we're carving into, and we're actually augmenting ourselves through these kinds of inventions that we made, all the way up to now. We've augmented how we transport ourselves with
we have always been augmenting ourselves.
Yes, exactly. It's just nothing new, except now it's augmenting the brain, which is taking.
Which is a quantum leap.
It is. If it's successful, it could be, right? In terms of evolution of humanity itself, right? It's quite an interesting way to look at how we progressed over the ages in terms of
Steve Jobs used to call the computer the bicycle for the brain. But what you're talking about is way beyond that. So you, Dr. Rajesh Rao, is talking about building an interface for the brain, in the sense that for thinking, you are building devices where I can think, just think, and make changes in the world.
Yes.
I saw you had an NPR thing where there was this reporter who came and was able to communicate with somebody else in another room simply by thinking.
In a very rudimentary sense.
Of course, with electrodes attached.
It wasn't telepathy.
It wasn't
in
telepathy.
that sense, but it was computer-assisted, telepathy, if you want to call it that.
Well, sooner or later you'll just make it wireless, and then you'll call it telepathy.
Sure, yeah. So the motivation for a lot of that came through, helping people who are paralyzed and who cannot communicate. So, for example, people with ALS,
right.
Stephen Hawking
Yeah.
had that disease. So I think a lot of the field is focused on building communication devices for people who are completely paralyzed or who might benefit, from stroke, for example, if they can benefit from communication or control of devices because they cannot control their own body.
Yeah.
But they can control, a prosthetic hand or like a robotic hand or even a robotic wheelchair, for example, for mobility.
But that's just a starting point.
That's just a
Rajesh.
starting point for
that's
augmentation.
that's just an
Yes.
excuse. So come on.
You got right to the point, right? Yes. So I think it's a very important point to make now because the field is really, I think it's taken off already, right?
Yeah.
So what we're doing at our center, the Center for Neurotechnology here at the University of Washington, is addressing exactly that aspect of it, which is, what if you go beyond the realm of rehabilitation and restoration of function to augmentation of human function? What are the ethics of that, right? So neuroethics is a very
it's a
core
big field.
area of, and we are actually leaders in the field here at the University of Washington. So
Really?
we have our thrust leaders are actually from philosophy.
Yeah.
So we have philosophers. So Sarah Gehring is a professor in philosophy. She's part of our center
Yeah.
for neurotechnology, and we're looking at all those issues. So we're doing studies of people that have implants in their brains for Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, and we're asking them how it's changed their personality. We're talking about agency. So these devices can alter, how you perceive yourself, and who's in control when you have a device interacting with your brain. So there's a lot of really important issues that come through, and you can also ask their family, right? So the caregivers and their spouses might say this person has changed after they've been implanted with this device, which was supposed to be helping them with the motor function, right? Preventing tremors, for example, but it might also have some other effects which were not intended, right? So we're exploring all of those ethical
it's
issues.
like the artificial leg discussion with Amy Mullins.
Yes.
With her legs,
Yes.
sort of she can run faster than anybody.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
So you're making your sort of brain enhancement
Yes.
devices.
You can think about that, right? You can think about, okay, what does it mean to augment different aspects of your not just physical capacities, which is something we can do now with robotics and so on, but also your mental capacities, right? So memory.
Well, that's what a computer is.
Skills.
It's
in a sense, we're using computers for that, right? Memory, we're using it for information, so just accessing information. You no longer have to store it all inside your skull, right? It's actually out there, but you can access it using these devices that we have, right? But then, you can ask, like, what does it mean for the future, right, of humanity itself? Like, how are we actually going to judge intelligence, right?
Okay, Rajesh.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about this.
Some things.
I know something, but I have heard time and again. Beware artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Plenty of people are sounding the alarm.
Yes. So that's artificial intelligence, which is machines that can think for themselves.
Yes.
And what we're doing here at the at my research is trying to combine the benefits of artificial intelligence for human intelligence, right? So that's the merger of artificial and human intelligence. And so you can think of it as one way of saying, okay, how do we make sure that humans are integral part of that loop where you're actually interacting with it, but you're not, the AI is not exactly, going on its own and doing bad things, right? If that's what you're afraid of, you can sort of think of it as...
So you think your work is a check on unbridled
some
AI?
people think that. I mean, I actually think AI by itself, where it is now, is we are nowhere near that kind of a threat, that it's a threat to humanity's existence.
But do you think it's a threat?
But if it's done, I mean, if it is done in an uncontrolled way, then sometime in the future, potentially could be. I don't think we can rule that out.
What's the threat?
The threat is that it might cause, it might cause destruction in a way that perhaps, humans might not cause. So it might be. So the whole goal of AI is optimizing a particular, function, right? So, and they tend to be very narrow. So right now the AI might be something that tries to find faces in your photographs, and that works really well, right? So it's a very narrow function it serves. Right. But now, if you imagine that as being another, AI that is also optimizing a very narrow function that the human engineer gave it. But the only way to optimize, or the best way to optimize that function, is actually causing harm to another human.
It's that safety pin, the clip example.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, there's many examples of in Hollywood, right? Where there's this AI that's trying to help, one particular kind.
Black Mirror.
Yeah, exactly. Right. If you look at Black Mirror, many of the episodes are based on that.
Right.
So the danger, I think, is in terms of us engineering AI. So computer scientists engineering AI that are very narrowly focused, that work great for a particular purpose. But if the AI is only thinking in a very narrow way and doesn't have human values or cultural values attached to it, then there is a danger in the future that it might be optimizing at the detriment of humans that are not in its own kind of optimization field of view.
Okay,
right?
So that's we're talking about autonomous AI, kind of running on its own.
It's autonomous to the extent that it's allowed to take certain actions, and those actions in some way could potentially harm humans. Right, that's where the danger comes.
Okay.
If it's only an AI that's recognizing faces in an image, I mean, there are some privacy issues. Obviously, it could, but it wouldn't be able to physically harm a human unless it has the capacity to do so. Right?
So you are sort of doing a merger, a sort of a marriage.
Yes.
Between brain thinking.
Yes.
And let's say AI thinking.
That's one way to look at it. Is that we're trying to have humanity or humans actually sort of co-evolve in a sense, right, with whatever the advances are, where we're
going to evolve us?
Yes, we're actually evolving ourselves in some sense. I mean, we're already doing that with smartphones and the internet,
right?
And this is basically another tool to let us, understand how is that really going to help us as humans.
Okay,
right?
What's your tool?
Yeah.
Describe to us the things you put on our head.
Right.
What are you building? Just dumb layman's description
Sure.
of what you make.
Yeah, so think of it as a device that can extract information from the brain, and you can do that in different ways. You can do it completely non-invasively through a cap, which is what we use in our lab. No surgery required. There's another way, which would be to actually open the skull, put a layer of wires on top of the brain itself. We do that in the hospital, but that's only for patients who come in for brain surgery. For epilepsy, for example. And finally,
you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do that, but my collaborators do in the hospital, like in Harborview and in Seattle Children's, for example. So these are all medical, treatments, right? But they are implanted on the surface of the brain,
right?
And then there's some patients, a few of them around the world, actually, not here in Seattle, but in some of our collaborators' lab in other places, where they implant these wires inside the brain itself, right?
Wow.
And we do that here only for patients who have a medical need for that. For example, if they have tremors, so like essential tremor or Parkinson's disease, that's called deep brain stimulation.
I see.
So that case, you're sending electrical pulses as a pacemaker directly into a deep structure in the brain.
Okay.
So that's also an example of an interface, but that's not reading or extracting signals. It's writing or it's sending information into the brain or pulses into the brain.
Right.
Now, if you look at it in a big picture sense, the whole device, you can call that a brain-computer interface or a brain-machine interface.
Right.
And the idea there is it can extract information from the brain, and it can send information back to the brain.
Okay.
And so you can close the loop. But what it's doing is in between, it's actually doing something useful for the brain, right? So it could be sending that information to control a cursor on a computer screen where you can write an email to your loved ones. If you cannot say things because you're paralyzed, you can use it to write an email. So that's an example of a brain-computer interface.
Right.
You could also, for example, control a robotic hand that goes and picks up, a cup for you to feed yourself. So people have shown that. A woman, who was paralyzed for many years was able to finally, after many years, for the first time, she was able to pick up a cup of coffee or a bottle of coffee and then feed herself. Okay. And she did that only by using her brain signals. Right. So the computer extracted that signal and then parsed it by using AI, machine learning techniques. So it was trained for many days to understand her brain signals. Right. And then it used it to move the robotic hand up and down, left and right, and then finally grasp a cup and then bring it to her mouth, and she was able to drink right from a straw.
So you're telling me my brain generates signals that are let's say indexed to what I'm thinking? Yes.
So for example, right now as you lifted your hand and you gestured, your brain generated those particular patterns from the motor cortex is an area that sends those patterns of signals to the muscles through the spinal cord. It's controlling the muscles of your forearm and your hand,
Yeah.
and that in turn caused your hand to move in a particular way.
Yeah.
But if if I'm given access to that particular area of your brain and I'm reading those signals also simultaneously, then I can form a correlation between, okay, here's your hand movement and here's what the brain pattern looks like.
But those signals are traveling down the spinal cord, right?
It's generated first in the brain.
Right.
And then it travels down the spinal cord, and then information comes back to your brain again from touching. Suppose you touch a cup, it's going to send information back, right? So your brain is both sending and receiving information all the time.
So how can you target so exactly where in the brain it's sending down a signal, pick up that coffee cup?
Well, so interestingly, the brain is organized in a very systematic manner in terms of different locations on your brain, different areas are controlling or receiving different kinds of information. So for example, there's an area that we can identify that is called the motor cortex that controls, for example, movement across the body, right? Now within that area, we can go a little bit deeper, and we can then, for example, every time you move your hand, we can record from many areas and see which one lights up or gets more active.
Okay.
And we can do a mapping. Right. We can also send little pulses of electricity and see, is it causing your hand to twitch?
And what do you mean lights up?
It increases in activity. So these are cells.
Increases in activity. Electrical impulses.
Electrical impulses
across the synapses.
Across the you can look at it as across synapses, or even if you're recording from a single cell or a group of cells. Then when there's an increase in the electrical pulses that area is sending to control your muscles.
So everything works by electrical pulses?
It's electrochemical. So the synapses are actually chemical. Right? In most cases there's a chemical, but the communication long distance from the brain to the spinal cord and spinal cord to the muscles are electrical.
That's electrical.
And they're done to electrical pulses, like a 0 or 1 kind of binary signal. And it needs to be binary because it's the brain's the nervous system has found a way to send these in a very fast way. Sort of
so
jumping
it has to go at the speed of light.
It zooms really slow actually compared to the speed of light.
It is?
Yeah, it is much
So
slower.
there's a speed?
There's a speed, yeah.
What's the speed at which a signal goes from my brain?
So it's basically the transmission from one synapse to another. It's usually in the millisecond time scale, so a couple of milliseconds. But
so how much time did it take from my brain to my fingertip?
It might be a few, anywhere from if it's a reflex, for example, a few tens of milliseconds, could be about 200, 300 milliseconds, right? That you have this traveling signal from your brain to, so there's different speeds depending on whether the pathways are myelinated or not. So some of them are, they have these special kind of hardware that zooms this electrical pulse down that pathway, but others don't have that, so it depends.
So there are some highways and there's the mall road also.
Exactly, you can sort of think of that, right? In that way.
Right.
But yeah, so I think the key is that we all have some uniformity. Which parts of our brain control which parts of our body, which parts receive information. So the visual system is receiving information from the back of the head, is a visual cortex, is what receives a lot of the information, then propagates that information towards the center of your brain, and then once you cross the center line, it becomes more motor. So it's all the parts that plan, what you're going to do during the day, and there's some hierarchical structures there that says, okay, today I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then you break it down, and then by the time it comes to the motor cortex, it's gone to the level of moving individual fingers or moving your legs and so on.
The motor cortex is where?
It's in the very top of your skull. So it's right at the center line, near the center line of the skull, towards the front part of your brain. And the back part tends to be sensory. So that's more, you can have visual perception being received from the retina, and then as you get towards the side of your brain, you start to see also auditory. So near the ears, that part is where you get initially the auditory information from your ears. And then as you go towards the top part of your brain, the sensation from your skin, right? So there's a very nice mapping.
So where in the brain do I think philosophy?
Yes, so thinking is interesting because it's a word that means you're it's an abstract word. It's not like a very specific mapping from muscle, from brain to muscle, or from skin. So it involves a lot of portions of the brain. So when you're thinking, you might be imagining, going through a particular, area of your house and so on. That might activate your visual system. So the brain co-opts many of these systems to do things like thinking.
So thinking is all the systems sort of working in concordance?
Yes. So it could be that you're shut off if you're for example, it's similar to dreaming, right? So you're kind of using your system in a freewheeling kind of way to not enact those actions, but you're using it as a simulator. So you're using your brain as a simulator. It's like a model of the world that you've learned right from the time you were born. And that model is being used to propose hypotheses of, okay, what happens if, for example, I do X or Y? And you can run that simulation in your mind, right, in your brain, by using many of the same circuits that you're using to do the actions.
So writing a novel is running simulations, right?
In some sense, yeah. So you could be...
Or imagining the film that I'm going to make, I'm running simulations.
Yes. So that's
But we use simulations all the time in daily life, right?
Yes, which is why I think, so I've worked in, this area of computer modeling of the brain. So we don't just build devices, but we're also trying to understand the brain, because they both go hand in hand. So one of the most, I think, the sort of richest theories of the brain right now, of how the brain works, is that the brain is essentially, it's learning an internal model of the world. And one of the theories is that it's constantly trying to predict what it's about to receive. And when there's a violation of that prediction, then that's a novelty or surprise signal. But the whole game is always to, whenever you see novelty, try to learn it and predict it, and then suppress that novelty.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons why, you don't pay attention to things that, so once you're in this room, you've sort of figured out the room, you have a model of this room. So you're not going to notice anything unless, there's something that falls off the wall, or you hear a big bang, right? And that's catches your attention because it's a novel phenomenon, right? So it's a very interesting theory of predictive brain. I worked a little bit on that, the predictive coding model of the Cortex. And so that model, it helps us to start to understand a lot of interesting phenomena in neuroscience, and also phenomena that have to do with visual illusions. It's all about the brain learning a model of the world, but using it for predictions.
But the simulation model that you were talking about, I mean, that's architecture.
Yes,
we are in the business of simulation making.
Yes, and we have that in our brains, right? I mean, we have a model.
We simulate built environments. And then we transfer them into readable documents that construction managers can make. Right. This is core to our business.
Exactly. And so, in fact, I think the brain's already beat you to it, right? It's already it's already doing that, right? It's been doing that for millennia.
Using that, right?
It's in the business of architecture in some sense.
But it's everywhere. I'm thinking of crossing the road. I imagine myself crossing the road.
Exactly.
And so on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you can think of the brain as, it can architect thoughts, right? It can architect.
What do you mean architect thoughts?
It can imagine situations that you might never have been in.
Yeah.
Right? Because
my brain does that all the time, my man.
Exactly. Which is great. I think imagination is key to creativity, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that we are creative as human beings, right, means that we have the capacity to use our model in the brain. So the cortex is a big part of it, the cerebral cortex, but there's also other structures. We're using that as a way to try out different kinds of scenarios.
Right? So we know all about trying out. Now, before we go further deep into your technology, I want to, since you have brought up simulation, query you what you think of this whole new interest in psilocybin and sort of mind-altering, I suppose, dark drugs, which make the brain see and feel like it is there in other kinds of consciousnesses.
Right. Well, I guess since I have not personally experienced that, I'd probably not be an expert in that. But I would say that the kinds of effects that these drugs might have in the brain is essentially to perturb some of these models that we might have learned during the course of our lives, such that it's almost like you're sort of shaking this, kind of a model that you have up, and shaking it up in such a way that when it comes back to, when it actually tries to settle down, right, then you're in an altered state, right? And that lets you potentially explore a whole alternative reality, right? So,
and we call them genius in other places. When Van Gogh does it,
right. Or it also happens, when, for example, if you're really starving your brain of, nutrients and so on, like, for example, you're you're actually, not eaten food for many days. You're starving yourself.
Yeah. Like the yogis.
Yes, like the yogis, right?
Yes,
and
yes,
then
yes.
suddenly you feel, okay, I have this vision.
Yes, right. Like the
right?
Buddha sitting in the people.
Yeah, I mean, one theory is that a lot of it was brain starvation, right? So when you starve your brain, you're able to, your brain goes into this completely different state that might, the perception of that starved brain state might be this kind of altered reality, right? We also see that with sleep deprivation. So that's a different kind of altered reality where sleep deprivation will make you hallucinate. So this is this idea of the brain's constantly generating its own internal reality and matching it with the external reality. And that's the whole this predictive coding idea. But now if the external reality is no longer modulating your internal creations,
then your brain goes berserk.
Exactly. That's
it's like I'm free.
Exactly. So then you have those states, right? Sometimes drugs make you go into that state. Sometimes it's lack of sleep. You start to hallucinate. So hallucination is nothing but the brain being overly creative or overly imaginative, right?
But you're a man of Indian philosophy also. It says here you're interested in Indian art and Indus script and probably read some Indian philosophy. The Indian philosophy says the external world is all Maya.
Yes.
It's all a hallucination.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very interesting, concept, right? It kind of fits into this idea of, a brain in a box kind of theory also, right? Which is that for all we know, everything could be a simulation. And
we could be somebody.
Exactly. It's like the Matrix, right?
The Matrix,
So as far as the brain is concerned, the brain inside our skulls, it doesn't care as long as it's receiving information that's correlated and makes sense in a statistical fashion, right? So it can create.
That's right. That's the Matrix theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The brain would never know.
Right. It would never know. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that part is what we're playing with in these devices that we're constructing. Is we have so the latest paper that I published was on a neural coprocessor idea, which was the idea that the brain can have a coprocessor, just as a computer can have a processor that works with it. So you can augment the computer with additional coprocessors. The idea is you can now have a coprocessor that is also built similar to the same kind of networks of neurons or brain cells that the brain has. You can build a computer model of it.
You're making a digital brain.
Yes, so you can sort of think of it as a digital brain, except it's actually interacting with the brain in an online fashion, right? So it's actually receiving information from the brain, processing it, and then sending information back to the brain. So it's almost like you've added an additional brain area. Right?
I need one, man, for mathematics.
But think about that, right? So if that really, so that's just a theory right now.
Yeah.
But if that happens to be powerful enough.
So you're talking about brain upgrades.
Yeah, so think about then this question of consciousness.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what happens now if you're now using this device as another brain area and it's constantly interacting with your natural brain, and over time maybe this artificial brain is giving you more and more functionality, you're relying on it more and more because it lets you communicate with other people, with other across the internet and so on. Now what do you mean to say, okay, what is you? And in that case, right? And where's your consciousness?
Where is consciousness?
Yes,
Tell me.
Exactly. And that's something we don't know yet. We don't know what consciousness
just in the brain. Where is consciousness?
We don't know. I think we think that there are certain areas of the brain that are crucial for it. So for example, the cortex and there's the prefrontal cortex, so we're not there yet in terms of a product. But you're right. You never know, right? You never know what that breakthrough is going to be.
Okay, now, but connect some dots here for me. You are CSE, you're computer science and engineering. You're supposed to be a nerd. Everything you have described to me makes you look like a neurosurgeon or a brain scientist, who looks at the brain.
Yes.
And puts probes in and tries to understand the brain.
Yes, no, but
Which are you?
I'm both. So I'm a computational neuroscientist. So I did my PhD, as you said, in computer science and engineering.
Yeah.
But I did 3 years of postdoctoral, research at the Salk Institute.
Oh yes, you were. You were at Salk.
I was at Salk.
Louis Kahn's Salk Institute.
Exactly. Yeah, yes. And it was a wonderful environment. Beautiful architecture.
What do you mean wonderful environment? It's supposed to be brilliant for scientists.
Yes.
I think you're a scientist and a good one, all because of architecture.
Yes.
All because of Louis Kahn.
I think so. I think that was very, very instrumental in who I am today. So, and I keep going back there, right?
You do?
So yes.
You love it, huh?
Every time that there's a conference there, I definitely go back, visit the Salk. I even had one of those offices that was facing the ocean.
Oh, you did. You had one of the best offices
for very last year of I think I was a senior postdoc at that time. So I was able to get one of those offices. It was beautiful. I mean, it was like a wonderful environment.
Did it stimulate your research?
I'm sure.
I'm sure it stimulated your brain. Because architecture.
Yes.
I mean, this is one question we have over here.
Uh-huh.
How is architecture acting on you?
Yes.
I mean, obviously, we want to make a chair, that you can sit on or get enough light here.
Yeah.
But that's such a rudimentary thing.
Uh-huh.
I mean, architecture is well beyond that. We believe we act on you in intangible.
Yes.
We call intangible, but actually neurobrainical ways.
Yes, yeah. In fact, I mean, there's even an Academy of Neuroscience for architecture, right? I don't know if you heard of that. It's like ANFA, ANFA.
ANFA?
Yeah, and I think they had a meeting at the Salk some time ago. And this Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture, they're doing some interesting research on the connections between neuroscience and architecture.
Really?
And yes, I think it's actually really, interesting because if you think about it, I was mentioning these, EEG caps that you can wear and wearing them in the lab. Imagine wearing that and entering a building.
Yeah.
And being there for a while, right?
Yeah.
You're actually going to get a sense of how does a person actually feel about being in this environment, right?
Yeah.
And you can do studies, right?
Yeah.
Maybe people are already doing it. I'm not aware of it, but you can do studies of what are the effects of being in a particular environment.
Yeah.
You could even do a prototype in virtual reality. And there are now virtual reality headsets you can get.
Yes. So then you can be immersed in that environment.
Yes. So you're in the environment, but you also have EEG cap on.
Right.
So now
we know what you think about it.
Yes. How do you feel about that? I mean, is it causing you some stress or not? Right.
Yeah.
Do those kinds of studies.
Right.
The only issue is right now these devices. I mean, we have mobile devices now, so you can have mobile headsets like with these EEG caps.
Yes.
But they tend to be not as robust to movement. So if you're jumping around or you're speaking, they're going to see those signals in these record devices.
Right.
But I think measuring the brain, right, could be a very interesting added dimension to architecture.
Totally.
Right. So you could be coming up with those kinds of
because
measures.
we are producing in sort of complex level sensual experiences through architecture, right?
Yep.
And I mean, it isn't just wayfinding.
It's right. It's not just so the brain has some people have done a lot of work on spatial navigation in the brain, going from rats all the way to humans. So there was this interesting study of taxi drivers in London, and they looked at the brain of taxi drivers versus other non-taxi drivers and found that the area of the brain called the hippocampus that's responsible for a lot of the spatial navigation that we do is huge, right? It's actually very, very overcompensated for those taxi drivers. Right. And so I think we can see those kinds of interesting, correlates of brain function reflected, as a consequence of the environment that we live in.
Okay.
Your brain's going to be adapting.
Okay.
So a person who's,
so some parts of the brain are particularly developed for different things.
Yes, and we're constantly, I think, also, the brain is also, a lot of the memories that we have are always in terms of space or the locations.
Yeah.
So when you imagine certain things, you'll also imagine being in a location.
Right.
So all that is encoded as part of our code. For our memories.
Yes.
Right? And so in fact, I mean, a long time ago, I think people used to. I think back in the medieval times, people used to memorize things by putting things in imagined locations. Right. As a way to remember things.
Yeah, it's a mnemonic device.
Yes, exactly. So architecture there was kind of being used as a way, to spatially, structure.
Yes, space is embedded in the brain's way of thinking.
Exactly. Right.
The prefrontal cortex works spatially. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's one of the areas involved. There's hippocampus, which is also in a short-term memory and spatial navigation and so on. There's parietal cortex, which is also in the central part, which is involved. In fact, our brain, the visual system parses visual information into these two so-called streams.
Right.
One is looking at content, which is that's a cup, that's another bottle, and that's a book, and so on.
Right.
But another pathway is looking at the spatial relationships between these objects. So there's something to the left of me, something ahead. There's a vertical thing that's in front, and so on. So those kinds of that kind of information is available to the brain as we plan to make our movements. Right? So those are really important features to have. So one is for recognition, the other might be more for planning and for actions and so on.
So where are sort of more emotional systems?
Right.
So where do you feel beautiful,
yes,
angry,
yeah,
and so on?
So those tend to be what are deeper structures and even older structures of the brain.
Older and deeper structures.
Yeah, so structures that are buried below the cortex, which is this big tissue that's usually that's what you see when you look at a picture of the brain, right? That's the cerebral cortex.
Yeah.
But as you go below that, there's some older structures like the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional, expression and so on.
Yeah.
But those are not isolated; they are interacting with the cortex, and there's always interactions going on between the top and the other areas of the brain, the cortex and other areas. Hippocampus also is connected, to the emotional centers.
Right.
So it's a very dynamic system.
Right.
But when you art is really tricky because some parts of art might be, it doesn't appeal to the same to different people, right? So some people might not like abstract art, others might like surreal art and so on. So basically, you have different kinds of emotions that are generated according to your own, I guess, the model that you built for yourself, right?
Right.
And so people have tried to do the neuroscience of art. It's still, I think, a very early stage in terms of what does it mean for something to be beautiful.
Right.
Is it symmetry?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be learned.
Who knows? It's very complicated.
It is complicated, yeah.
So there is the neuroscience of architecture and then there's the neuroscience of art.
Art, yes. And there's connections between them, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Because
and all of these are connected by the neuroscience of desire and
yes. I mean, there's a lot of motivation. So people look at what does it mean to be motivated to do certain things. So there's a whole structure called the basal ganglia that's involved in the kinds of behaviors that you learn and so on. So there's different areas of the brain that you can then start to study to understand some of these interactions.
So one thing I'm taking away from everything you're saying is it's all about how you train the brain.
Yes, that's
so
key.
So training is key.
That's key, yes.
So education is key, exposure is key, repeated exposure is key.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, so basically we're born, with the basic kind of structures, right? That's our genetically evolved, structure that we're born with.
Right.
But once you're born and you're in the environment, the brain's essentially a learning machine, right? It's basically it just takes in all the information coming in, tries to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And there's even this notion of a critical period, right? Which is that the early stages, you're laying the foundation, right? Just like a building, you're laying a foundation for what's going to be built on top later.
Is that how it works? I mean, that your early years are absolutely critical?
They're critical because, that's seen, for example, most clearly in language learning.
Sure.
There's some languages where there's some syllables that you won't even perceive.
Right?
So, for example, in Japan, people might not perceive the word or even say the word ra, like my name, Rajesh Rao.
Yeah.
I often hear Rajesh Lao. Right? So the ra gets mapped to a la.
Yeah.
And that's because they're born in an environment where there's no need or there's no distinction between those kinds of syllables, right? And so the early years are very critical in laying the foundation.
Okay, so but that's still a kind of a motor. I'm talking about, they say in psychoanalysis that whether you were breastfed or not is a critical thing in terms of how you relate to human intimacy and things like that. And these are sort of deep structures to your amygdala level.
Yes, that's possible. I think, any kind of input you get, right, from your mother, the smell of your, environment, the smell of the people you're interacting with, the kind of food you're eating, it could be breastfeeding or bottled milk, whatever it is. All that is used to shape the brain is being shaped by all of that, right? And then, of course,
but what I'm asking is, are these sort of indelible marks, or is this the brain constantly learning and adapting and changing?
It is. So a lot of the brain is, pretty much all of the brain you can say is, devoted to learning. But there's some areas that are much more plastic, which is, much more adaptable than others. But
which are the parts which are unadaptable? This is what I want to know.
So the ones that are harder, I would say, to adapt are the ones that were, the lower level, quote unquote, lower level ones, which are, things like if you look at, let's say, the visual cortex, right? In that, there, if you go and study each of the cells that are there in the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex, they tend to respond to things like little bars, edges, because like this particular bookcase is composed of many, many vertical edges all aligned together. And there's many books there which are horizontal lines and vertical lines. So you can compose a scene with these building blocks, which are these little bricks, right? These edges. So those were learned very early on, maybe even during evolution, because those were very fundamental to any kind of environment that the animal is born in. So most animals get born with this very low level kind of building blocks of cognition or visual, right? So then to change those, it would be difficult because you evolved to really have those, even though you can change the frequency in which these occur. So maybe like they did some experiments where the kitten was placed in an environment where they only saw vertical lines, and the kitten then pretty much lost the ability to perceive a horizontal line, right? For example. So there is some plasticity still left in the brain, but it's restricted, right? But as you go to the higher levels, that's where you start to form skills, learn skills, memories, facts, you know, and things like that, knowledge. Those are all, you know, very, very open-ended kind of areas, right? These are areas that can be shaped and reshaped over time, over many, many years and through your life, right?
I see.
But you do need to have that foundation to build on, right? So your memories of the early childhood are not there as much because you at that stage you were still probably building the foundation. So any memories you had are all changed now because the foundation was still changing. But once that's solidified, then you can keep storing all the later memories, and those are still there fresh. I mean, they're still there somewhere in the brain, right? And so those can be shaped and adapted and so on. So the brain is constantly, you know, this learning. It's learning all the time, essentially, right? And it is one of the things that we've seen in our studies with these devices, right, is that the brain can shape itself to control these devices, which evolution never imagined, right, that we'd be controlling. I mean, the brain was evolved to control our body.
Evolution,
right?
Evolution's going on right now.
Yes, and it evolved to control our body, right? But then we have these tools, which we're now using, right? And eventually, you know, the brain is so plastic or so adaptable that it can actually be used to control these very arbitrary kinds of devices, like a robot that's sitting somewhere else, or, you know, it could be used to control a cursor on a computer screen, which is a very different kind of control than controlling a finger, right? Or controlling the muscles, let's say, right, of your body. It could be a very kind of different way of controlling, but it can learn. So it takes a while for it to learn, but it can learn, you know, over many repetitions to control these devices.
Right.
So we're getting a window into learning, also into plasticity in the brain through the research that we do. So I think we've spanned pretty much all of neuroscience.
We're just starting here, my friend. We are just starting. This is such
Might have to come back many days.
This is such an amazing topic. I can imagine doing 20 things, but I want one more question before we turn to the Indus Valley script. You know, I want to get your thoughts on, you know, complex emotion and complex behavior and ambiguity in the human mind. You know, how do we sort of deal with the unknown things, and yet we deal with them, right? We hold unformed ideas in our brain.
Yes. No, that's a very crucial question, even for you know, artificial intelligence and robotics, right? So there is a theory of the brain called the Bayesian theory of the brain. So
yes, Bayesian you have brain. A book on Bayesian theory. Yes.
And so the idea with the Bayesian brain is that, you know, there's always going to be uncertainty in what you perceive and what you have knowledge of, and so the brain is built to handle that uncertainty.
Right.
And so from a mathematician's point of view, you can think of it as a probability distribution. So you say, okay, you know, any kind of thing that you're perceiving or imagining, there's going to be some kind of, think of it as a mean and a variance, right? There's some variance there, right? There's some amount of uncertainty there. And then the whole, Bayesian viewpoint is that you're when you receive new information, you're combining it with your prior knowledge using Bayes' theorem, which is a mathematical theorem that shows how do you combine the probability of something coming in with what you already have in your mind, right? And it's constantly doing that. It's always updating what it has stored, what it has estimated so far from everything it's received with the new information coming in. That's the whole Bayesian viewpoint. And so when you think about the complex, kinds of phenomena, like how are we really perceiving something that's really complex? So even the visual scene that we take in, right? When you go into a room, it's very complex. And computers are only now beginning to figure that out, right? So AI only now is able to recognize and say, okay, that's a bookshelf, that's a computer, and so on in a room. But even then, it's got a lot of issues, right? Whereas the human brain can, almost instantaneously recognize what the situation is. And so if you look at the architecture of the brain, what you see there is, there's these divisions of labor, right? Like I said, there's different locations. So it might be, parceling information out into different kinds of factors. So one might be, okay, these are all, color aspects of the scene. This might be the location of objects in the scene. Here's how objects are moving in the scene and so on. So there's a little bit of that going on. But there's also, in many cases, a hierarchical structure. So you divide things up into pieces. And then what you have then is building one on top of the other until you get to a very complex feature at the top, right? So you must start off by saying this room, the image of this room is composed of just edges. Everything is an edge. But that's when you're looking at a very tiny piece any point in time. But you can string together many edges and then form, a bookshelf, right? And then so on and so forth. And you can combine many books to form a whole bookshelf, right? And then you put many bookshelves together, put a chair and a table, and you have an office. Right. And put many offices together, you have a building. Right. So it's a hierarchy, right? And we do see that in the brain also, where some initial areas of the brain that receive information tend to be very rudimentary, But as you go towards the quote unquote top,
the top is where prefrontal cortex.
Part of it. I mean, there's a motor hierarchy and there's a sensory hierarchy, right? And they both sort of converge, and they're talking to each other also. And then the hippocampus, which is where you store some short-term memories. It has very, very complex kind of representations. So it might be combining smell with touch with vision, all that combined, right? And it might be a very abstract representation of where you are in space, and what you're hearing, what you're feeling, and so on, right? So there is that notion of a hierarchy. So I think we manage complexity partly through the architecture of the brain being evolved in such a way that there's modularity, and you're building on top of the existing functionality. And evolution does that, right? So it can change a few genes here and there, have some mutations, and then add another area, for example, right? Or something similar to what it already has, but see what happens if it adds a little more functionality. And if it's helpful for survival, then it preserves it in future generations, right?
Well, if it's for survival or it's helpful for the human experience.
So it could be, whatever reason that evolution, whatever metric it used, right? It got propagated in generations.
Last I heard, evolution uses error and trial and error and mistake and whatever.
I mean there's going to be a lot of that
environment is going to decide that.
Yes, the environment plays a huge role. And there's species that get extinct in one location, but they may survive in a different location, right?
That's right.
So that happens all the time, right? So that's the key. I think the key is that the architecture of the brain is designed in such a way that it allows for complexity and ambiguity. It manages it, at least. It manages the uncertainty, manages the complexity.
And that's the argument for interdisciplinarity. A university should work like a brain, where there is all this, constant communication. Instead, we just sort of retreat into our own particular
silos,
amygdala, and
no, that's not how the brain works. I mean, there's constant. I mean, it used to be a very reductionist field, like neuroscience. In some cases, still is, where everybody's just studying their own little area of the brain. But I think as a computer scientist and a computational neuroscientist, for me, I think at least I feel my duty is to look at what's happening and combine them in a holistic view of the brain. Because that's where I think we get into these questions like, awareness and consciousness and perception, all that combined.
I mean, the way I look at it, architecture, you want to understand, you need to understand how the brain looks at the space. we need to understand neuroscience.
It would be great. I mean, that would be.
I mean, this seems like a basic, and these seems to be like conversations one should have, and then what is sort of computation.
Yeah, I think it would give you lots of insights.
Yeah,
right. I mean, I think because ultimately you're building structures for humans.
Right.
And humans.
Well, not ultimately. No, in part we are building for humans, but we are building for the ecosystem.
For the ecosystem, right? But then you also want to know how are humans reacting to that structure when they're living in.
It's a key thing.
It's a key thing, and the brain is a window into that, right?
No, the brain is doing the processing.
Yes.
Brain is us living in there.
Right. So you are doing it for the brain. Ultimately, right?
Now, one other thought that occurs to me, Rajesh, is this massive, like you said, the Rajesh Rao example.
Yes.
Now that's simply at a sort of a phonetic level.
Yes.
But there are sort of deep cultural patterns, and those are laid down deep early in life.
Yeah.
This is an argument also for cultural conservatism in one sense, because I grew up in sort of middle class North India in a certain kind of cultural, intellectual milieu. Somebody else grows up in, rural Idaho.
Yeah.
Their sort of level of baseline coding is going to be very different.
Sure, definitely.
And there's no changing it.
So there is, I wouldn't say no changing it. I think it's possible to,
No, drastically we could change it via surgery or something, or significant recoding.
I think even education, right? I mean, education, as you said, is key. And if you cannot do it early on, let's say that, you are separate in high school. You're in, one person is in, rural Idaho, the other person is in, rural India, right? Very different, kinds of education and cultural education. It's possible, at the level of college is when you have that dramatic transformation where you really can have some alignment, right? If they go to similar types of universities, I think that's still possible. Now, if you go beyond that, so if they still did not go through that experience and now they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, I would say then it gets more difficult.
Yeah, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah, there you go. But I still have some hope that, if they're open-minded enough to
what do you mean by open-minded? We are talking about the mind already.
Yes, open-minded in the sense that there's a voluntary willingness. There's a willingness to, Rajesh, for example, take courses.
All these words, voluntary, don't have any meaning, because voluntary seems to suggest there's a sort of a blank subject. You're saying subjectivity is all constituted through coding of your neurons.
It is. Yes. I mean, I'm saying that if I wouldn't know how you would get a person who does not is not interested. Let's say, right, in
I'm talking about what themselves. Is it to be interested. I am interested in something.
Yes.
You're interested in something. Or somebody else. Our basic interests come from somewhere, and they're now deep coded.
Yes, it's hard. I think it's one way to do that would be a lot of people respond to peers, right? So it might have to come through people that they trust. And it's a social interaction that would encourage.
But
right?
This is all you're saying is this is our received understanding of how to change behavior.
Yes, I mean, if you want
talking
something
pure brain science, why?
I mean, dramatic interventions. There would have to be things where there are devices that they're interacting with which actually cause changes in their brains, right? So in fact, this is already happening with social media. Right, so these people are living in bubbles, for example, where they're looking at Facebook, and that is a brain interface. It's just an indirect it's an indirect interface. It's not direct interface, but when you interact with social media, you're reinforcing potentially like some of the conceptions that you have, preconceived notions you have.
My son lives in not Minecraft. What's that new game called? Fortnite.
Fortnite, okay.
So I'm thinking his brain is being wired into fortnightly perceptions of the world.
He has a very good internal model of Fortnite, essentially, the world of Fortnite.
Yeah.
And then when he comes out of it, he has to essentially load the real model of the world, but then he probably has some kind of intersection, because the circuitry is actually the same circuitry being used.
It's the same
right?
circuitry.
So he has to have, that's where the prefrontal cortex has to do the context switching, right? Saying don't use the Fortnite, model for this world. Yeah. So I think it's a very important question in terms of, what happens when you have brains that are exposed to, other kinds of worlds like games, video games. There's a lot of evidence showing that there are changes in the brain, and the brain starts to adapt to that environment, because that's where there's a goal-directed behavior going on. There's rewards that you get if you perform better in that field, and so I think there's a very interesting question about what's happening in terms of the brain real estate, right? Because there's only so many neurons in your brain.
No, but what I'm saying is early on, we were told stories. Maybe we were told stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
Yes.
Or we would watch Hum Log, or we watched, whatever we watched, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And the people out here that watch the Brady Bunch, or the,
Yes.
So that deep level, somewhere or the other, you're going to be coded in.
Yes.
At that deep brain level.
There's some. There's definitely a lot of that happening very early on and up to high school and so on. It is who you are, right? At that extent. But I think there's still some shaping going on after that.
Right.
And there's still opportunities to shape yourself. There are examples of people who went back to college, after they retired, and then I'm sure their personality has changed dramatically because they were exposed to people that they may not have been exposed to when they went to college the first time. So I think there are still opportunities for re-educating yourself in some way and changing some personality. But as you said, it's actually more and more difficult.
So we can still make you into an architect.
I'm always open to try out new opportunities. I can bring the EEG cap and we can run it here.
Let's do it.
We could do an experiment, right?
I want to do experiments.
We have a wireless EEG cap, and we could do an architecture experiment.
Let's do it. Let's do it. When are we going to do it?
Sure, if you have a good,
In fall, I run a studio.
Okay.
On fashion and architecture.
Okay. Yeah, maybe as part of that, I could have one of my students come by with the EEG cap, and you could. I think the cool experiment there would be to test different models, right, or different conceptions, and see what the reaction of the brain is of one person to different kinds of constructions, right? And then that would be part of the design process. Is the brain input. To the design process.
Yes, we should also put down the reviewers, the critics who come,
and
we really find out what they think.
You could. That could be part of their rating system.
Part of the rating system,
right? It's not the subjective, but this quote unquote brain input could be more objective, right?
Right. All right. Well, we'll wait to see what we learn. Rajesh, thank you so much for being on
you're
Architecture
welcome. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and thank you so much, for the opportunity to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. So, thank you. Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.